Hello, I hope everyone is healthy, safe, and well. I am Jacoria Borders, a program specialist here at the Blank Foundation, coming back for our series, There Is No Finish Line. For today's discussion, we have with us Ms. Marci McLean, the Executive Director of Western Native Voice. Established in 2011, Western Native Voice is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization working to increase Native American participation and engagement in voting and self-determination. Western Native Voice works to nurture and empower new Native leaders and impact policies affecting Native Americans through community organizing, education, leadership, and advocacy. They are engaged on all 7 Montana Indian reservations and also engaged in major Montana urban centers because approximately half of Montana's Native population lives off reservation. Without further ado, let's hop right in. Marci, how are you? How are you quarantining?
Well, I'm doing good. I think I have a lot to be grateful for. And, you know, I'm one of the fortunate ones who still have a paycheck and still have a home and food and all the basic necessities. So always keeping in mind those that are not as fortunate as I am to keep, you know, carrying on with the basic necessities of life. So I'm doing really good here. We're so close to one of the mile markers in the work that we do, and that happens every 2 years for us here in Montana, you know, and everybody else. But yeah, I'm doing okay. Weathering the storm and trying to make the best out of each day. And along with that comes some laughter and tears and heartache and stress and good times and opportunities and challenges. And so I just try to make the best of each day.
Absolutely, absolutely. So many of our viewers may not be from Georgia, may be from Georgia or elsewhere, and aren't familiar with the racial dynamic of Montana. So we could do a little bit of level setting here. Please kind of set the stage for us and give us an overview of the unique challenges that Native Americans face and the work that you do at Western Native Voice to kind of combat those issues. And honestly, also share us a little bit more about yourself and how you came to be a part of this work.
Sure. So I will start with myself and how my journey here. I'll share the condensed version, but my background is in the healthcare field. I have a 2-year degree in physical therapy and a 4-year degree in human biology. So I'm here kind of by happenstance or by fate, if you will. And I started doing data entry in 2012, right close to the election. And then I overseen the programs for the statewide, some of the programs for the statewide. We also have a C4 that we work for. And then I oversaw a C3 program on one of our very remote tribal nations in northeastern Montana. And I was new to everything, but I had a great coach and director at the time. And he helped me, Lauren Birdratler helped me learn the ins and outs. And I was just doing it for a temporary gig, I thought. But what I experienced that year in the election, we had some victories. We reelected a Native American woman to our statewide position of superintendent of public instruction. So she was the first, her name is Denise Juneau. She was the first Native American woman to be elected to a statewide position in the history of the United States. So just all the victories and the community, the sense of community that I felt, when we were all, hundreds of us were out there working across the state. And so that was, I liked that feeling. And so I stuck around and kind of checked it out and, wanted to learn more about what is all of this. Where I grew up and where I come from, it just wasn't a thing that I paid attention to. And it wasn't a big thing in my family to vote in the state and federal elections. So I didn't think my vote counted or my voice mattered. And my heart and my passion is for Indigenous women and girls. And I want all Indigenous women, in Native American women and girls to grow up believing in their own voice, and hopefully that also includes voting and civic engagement. Mostly, I think it touches me because I grew up in a family where I was told to be seen and not to be heard. I was to be seen and not heard. And I lived with that mentality for much of my life. In fact, until, I was just doing some personal work through this all too. But until that, going through that experience with my daughter, it was like, if I want my kids to have a voice, then I need to realize in my own voice. And so it was a combination of a personal journey I was on, and then the professional journey, with the organization and advocacy and that stuff. And I stuck around, and a couple of years later, I was hired as executive director. And so I've been executive director since 2014. And boy, has it been a learning curve. And it's been so exciting to be part of this organization. So I grew up on the Blackfeet Reservation, which is northwestern Montana. We have what are known as reservations. We are trying to decolonize the way we talk. So we call them tribal nations, because reservations seem so confining and so oppressive. It's an oppressive term. So there's all levels of decolonizing our language we have to work out. So anyways, most of our tribal nations are very remote. And we have to drive a long ways to access maybe not affordable, but quality food. The grocery stores that are in our remote reservations, I heard on a presentation that by the time the food, like the fruits and vegetables, get to these tribal nations or remote Montana, anywhere in Montana, the food has lost a significant percent of its nutrition. But yet we pay more money for all this food, in these remote areas. And, we have high poverty, we have high unemployment because we're very remote and away from all the places that offer employment. And, and I don't want it to sound like it's all bad. For some reason, that's where I just started, because we are very resilient people. We are very community based. So we do have a lot of strength. There's a lot of great things going on. As you can see, the likes of Deb Holland, Sharice Davids, Peggy Flanagan, they've all have powerful voices for Indigenous people across the nation. And so I will also say that we were the first ones here, and we were the last ones to get citizenship. We didn't become citizens of this United States of America until 1924. We didn't get the right to vote until the 60s, and sometimes in the 70s. In Utah, they were still keeping us from voting, much like the Jim Crow rules down in the South. When I got into this, I also started learning about everybody's right to, or fight for the right to vote. We had a World War II veteran come home from serving and went to vote, and he was denied the right to vote. And there's actually a video of him on our Western Native Voice website. If you want to go see it, that was one of the stories I heard early on, and it made me want to fight more for that equality and that right to vote. And it goes beyond the voting. It's more than just checking a box. It's holding elected officials accountable. It's running for offices yourself. It's meeting with elected officials. It's informing them and informing us. And I see it's a community thing, and it's a life commitment. For me, it was a life change of, what I thought was important, or what I talk about now. So we just want to see that change in our communities. So like I said, we have 7 tribal nations in Montana, and then we have one tribe that has just recently received federal recognition. So there's a big history that goes along with how the government has treated Native Americans, and they don't honor treaties. And some of the tribes were, erased, if you will, and weren't recognized as a tribe by the federal government. And so you'll hear about tribes, receiving federal recognition. And that is for funding, and so that they can get scholarships and whatnot for colleges and universities. So there's a lot that goes into it when we do receive our federal recognition, and our languages and our cultures were, and still are, they're threatened. We're trying to do things to revive our languages and our cultures as Native Americans. It was illegal to practice our ceremonies until 1978. So we couldn't even do any of the ceremonies. And so a lot of our tribes have, revived them in the best way that they could, sometimes borrowing from other tribes that had similar ceremonies. So it's been quite the journey, for us as Native Americans. And so I think that's where this organization is so powerful, because we're building a collective block of Native voters voting and talking and voicing our thoughts and our power together. We're based here in Montana. We helped launch a C4 in North Dakota. We have a C3 project in Idaho. And so we just want to keep growing, and you see other Native movements growing as well. Mostly from what I noticed, like mostly from like the Montana over to the West Coast and then down to New Mexico and Arizona, because that's where the Navajo Nation is, and that's the largest tribal nation in the United States. So there's a lot going on, and we still, along with other communities of color, we are still fighting for a little equal playing field. We want to start at the same starting line, right? Even though we don't have a finish line in our work, we still want to have that same starting line. And so I think all of us as voices of color, we will someday, I hope, achieve it. Maybe not in my lifetime, but maybe in my grandkids and my kids' lifetime.
Absolutely. Building on that, and I love how you stayed on brand with "there is no finish line." A commonly coined term from our chairman across all of our businesses here, of course, in the country, and especially in Montana. That's something he strongly believes in. So, stereotypes often, unfortunately, shape perceptions about different communities, right? We see this across ethnicities and identities, whether it's LGBTQ+, whether it's, the African-American community, the Native American community, Latino community. What are some actual misconceptions that Western Native Voices hopes to dispel? And ultimately, what do you want folks to understand and celebrate, actually celebrate about, modern Native communities?
Yeah. The stereotypes, there's so many of them. So I'll just kind of go over some that are at the top of my mind today. What I've learned meeting people back east, which I didn't even go back east. I have no desire to leave Montana, but I've traveled, on the East Coast with my job here, and I've been to Atlanta a couple of times with my job. But so I learned that people don't even know that we exist. So I guess one thing is we are still here. We don't live in teepees. We live in houses just like everybody else. Substandard housing, albeit sometimes, but it's like houses, and we drive cars, and, we dress in normal clothes, and we speak English, and, and it's like releasing that noble savage stereotype, right? Some people think, oh, you're Native, so you must grow plants and you must know about herbs and roots. And well, I can't even keep my houseplant alive myself. And I don't know how to go gather, and I don't know where to go gather. I'm learning those things in my later years because it's not something that was, practiced in our communities. So that's, one of the stereotypes. And also the other one, that we don't pay taxes. We pay taxes. We get free education. We don't. I personally have a gigantic school loan that controls my life right now. So we don't get free education. And my wife and I are living proof of that. How it just controls our lives. That we get free healthcare. And none of it is free. These were all treaty. The things we do get, I would say most of them are substandard. Our health service, Indian Health Service, is very much underfunded. So those are some of the stereotypes. I think, we're just trying to make it just like everybody else. And we're trying to heal from historical trauma of what has happened to our ancestors. You might hear a lot of negative things from our families and our communities. But the idea is there's a lot behind it. We're not just drunken Indians. We are Native Americans with a proud history and a proud culture of where we came from before. And it's just like getting that to be that front-facing part of us, rather than the pain and the abuse maybe that we went through, that shows through addictions and whatnot. So I think that's like the biggest stereotype that I would like to see, folks learn about, and see that, we have very kind and welcoming and giving communities and families. We have a lot of good athletes, and that goes from basketball to running to rodeo, and all different kinds of sports. And in fact, in Montana, they have a thing called the Montana Indian Athletic Hall of Fame. So where Natives are inducted into the Hall of Fame because of how, their great talents that they had. And I just think, we're very resilient people going through just, and I often, through my work, I've learned about African Americans or Black folks. And it's things that I think we don't know about each other right often. For us here in Montana, we don't have a lot of opportunity because we Native Americans, we are the majority of the minority, and we make up about 7% of the population here in Montana. And for me, you don't see a lot of Black folks. So there's not that opportunity for us to learn. But it's, again, through my work, I've traveled and I've learned a little tiny bit about, the commonalities that we have as folks. I mean, the big things like Martin Luther King, like we've all read about that, but on an individual level, like learning, and I've got to know some folks. And so just learning, about our paths and how they cross and how they diverge and how we agree and how we disagree, just like any other race or ethnicity. But so there's been a lot of resilience shown. People are reconnecting to the land and the language, as I mentioned. There's a lot of efforts at the state and federal level to support native language revitalization in our communities. And I just think, this another celebration is you've seen the increase in voting and civic participation in our communities. I've really seen, maybe because I pay attention now, but I've seen it just like mushroom out across the nation. And I think social media has helped with that a little bit because we can connect right on a grander scale. But, people have been fighting for different parts of civic engagement and democracy for a long time, as you guys are very well aware of. And I just think it's up here in Montana, it's like Native specific that we're fighting for it because we are the majority of the minority. But I will say, like, when we pass laws and legislations, we as an organization try to make it very inclusive. Like, we passed a bill that prohibited universities and high schools from not allowing us to incorporate our culture into our graduation from high school or college. So they couldn't, like, eagle feathers are very important. And when you earn an eagle feather, it's a big event and milestone in your life. So they wouldn't allow us to have eagle feathers or do beadwork on our mortar boards. And so we passed a bill saying that, you can no longer strip our culture from us in this way. And when we wrote the bill, it was inclusive of other cultures, maybe Muslims or Irish or whatever your culture is. However you want to include it, it is your decision now. So no community or culture can not include their customs and regalia into the graduation in that big day. So things like that. We try to be very inclusive.
So you touched on a couple of things that have literally led into my next series of questions. But I think I'm going to start in the order of literally how they come. And so you have been doing some incredible work around the census. So can you share some information on why it's so critical that all Native Americans are accounted for in our census, and how basically representation shapes the future for tribal nations in Montana?
Yeah, so, I mean, the obvious to those of us that are in this work is the funding, right? And that was the biggest message we tried to hammer home to our communities, because that's what we feel got them to move and get counted. And so, and the other thing for us here in Montana, we have 3 Native majority Senate districts. And all of that work was, we have those because of work of Janine Pease, Carol Juneau, and folks like that who have fought for some equal representation in our state. And so, those districts are drawn, and redistricting is all based on census. And so if, depending on what this count looks like, I'm not sure how, it all turned out with the COVID impacts and all, but those, especially some up on the north part of Montana, we're in jeopardy of losing those if we weren't counted. So that was a very strong motivator for our organization, and I think some of the funders, when we talk about representation, because there's 2 Senate districts that are on the north part of Montana, and that includes 2 House districts. So that's 6 elected officials that are elected in Native dense districts. There used to be the vote dilution before and the gerrymandering and stuff like that, which, we fear going back to to that kind of stuff. So that is one big thing that I think about often, after and being involved in redistricting and calls to action so that we don't lose our voice in the state capitol. We have the largest Native American caucus, state legislators, Native American caucus in the United States. We have 11 Native Americans that are elected to our state legislature. So that's pretty powerful. And they vote together on certain issues. It's a Republican and Democrat. There's one Republican and there's some Democrats, or the rest are Democrats, but they vote together on Native issues that are important to our community. So, it's a force to be reckoned with. People will listen because it's a bipartisan group and people go to them for advice and different things. So to lose any of those members would be really, I think, devastating to advancing issues for Native sovereignty and language and culture and voting rights, of course. And then, of course, the biggest one that really didn't move Natives, because I think often what we think is, how does this really benefit us? But the other one is we are on the brink of earning or being at a population big enough to have 2 representatives in the United States House of Representatives. So that's the other big one that drove, I think, a lot of funders to support the efforts, but it didn't drive our people to turn out really for getting counted. I think ours was more, what we figured was more the census. And then when we learned that the House districts, we were in jeopardy of losing the Native majority ones, that moved a few people. But yeah, those are the 3 big things of why we needed to get ourselves counted, and just to, know how many people are really, because we won't participate in a lot of stuff for the government because of the historic mistrust or distrust of the government. And so, when the census brings in people from out of state and sends them knocking doors, well, most people in our communities aren't going to open the door for a white person with a clipboard, right? It's probably somebody who's coming with bad news or, has a warrant or whatever, there's just different reasons why out of towners show up, or they're from the church or whatever. But what we do is we hire local people. So that's how we were able to get more folks to get counted, is hiring the local people who are known and respected and trusted in the community. And I think that's why our program is a success.
So what are specific barriers that Native Americans face when it comes to civic engagement in Montana? And specifically, what are the solutions that Western Native Voice is pushing to elevate?
For just the basics of registering to vote. The county seat is often off reservation, so right on the exterior boundaries of the tribal nation, and it historically has been mostly white. And racism is alive and well here in Montana, and it's a big deal. That's what we have here in Montana is a lot of racism and discrimination that takes place, and those border towns are where mostly non-natives live. And so there's even a group by the ACLU, our effort called Border Town Racism. And they're looking for ways to identify what the problem is and fix it. And whether it's litigation or whatever, how do we address these things that go on? And the over-criminalization of Native Americans. We make up, like I said, 7% of the population, but I think we make up 30% of the prison population or the incarcerated population. It's some high number like that. I might be off, but it's somewhere up like that. So that first barrier is that distance to the election services. There's only one county that offers a satellite election service that brings the election office or the county office into the tribal nation, and that's Glacier County. And so that's the biggest barrier is distance. We have high poverty, high rates of income, or high rates of poverty and low employment. And so we don't always have the fuel to drive. Not everybody owns a car. Not everybody has a driver's license. So that's the one barrier. And then just because the system is so new, we weren't allowed to vote until 1965. And so we're still learning about this system. And then the addressing systems are one, because we don't have, one uniform standard addressing system on most of our tribal nations. You got maybe your housing has a addressing system. And then maybe your city has another one, and then the tribal, or then the local intel or local, like we have on 700 or 600 Street. It's called Sesame Street, is another name for it. and 600 block or something. So we just have different names for different neighborhoods. And so part of that is educating and helping people learn, what is your street address? I know where the house where my mom grew up and my grandma and grandpa used to live, it didn't have they weren't numbered. There wasn't those little green signs up the street signs until maybe the last 10, 15 years or so. Then they start putting up those street signs, but not all of our communities have those street signs. So addressing is a huge thing because you have to have a address so that they can assign you to the right precinct, right? And so when we started doing this in 2012, we worked with a lot of the election administrators to accept a physical description of a unit, of a housing unit, so that they could best identify, we could say, go to mile marker, 42, and you turn left and go a mile and then left and another mile or something like that. And so most of the tribal governments the county governments were resistant to do that. So then there was legislation passed that, it had to be accepted. I think it passed in the last session or the session before, that a physical description was, acceptable for voter registration. And in the mailing system, we do not have mail delivered outside of our house on our tribal nations, most of them. For most of the residents, everybody gets their mail at a post office box. And so, the services are remote, so they're oftentimes limited. Like here in Billings, I think our post office is open from maybe 7 to 7 or something like that. But on our tribal nations, it's not 7 to 7. It might be like 8 to 5 or, maybe 10 to 1 or 10 to 3 or something. So very limited access for the postal systems. And so we've been working, with, and that's kind of out of our control, the way the postal system works, at least for right now. And so we've worked with and pushed for, and so have a lot of allies, pushed for satellite election services to be open on our tribal nations. And it's a hit and miss. It's nowhere near equal, except in that one place that I mentioned earlier. There might be a satellite election services like today, there's one in one of our tribal nations. So we have a robust kind of virtual and limited to no contact ballot pickup going on because of COVID is really hitting our Native communities right now. It's sad. One of our tribal nations, one of the smaller ones had a spell of 18 days where they had at least one death in their community. And it's a very small populated area. It's not no big city. So that's a huge loss to our communities. But anyways, it might be like 1 day or 2 days a week in a community to where this election service is brought to the people in the community. So that's a push that we're still trying to do. It's mandated federally in 3 of the counties, but I think we have 13 or 12 counties that are affected by tribal nations around the state of Montana. And so we only have 3 of them. So we will try again this year to introduce legislation to make satellite election offices required. And a lot of it goes back to the funding of the county. Our counties, if you look at a map of our counties here in Montana, the poorest counties are the counties that have majority tribal nation on them because of the economic opportunity. It's remote and there's not a lot of jobs to be had there. And so oftentimes people like myself choose to leave home and go live off the reservation at a big sacrifice. It's a huge sacrifice to have economic opportunity for me and to not have my family here with me, not have my culture, not have my land, not have, a sense of belonging and sense of community like I do back home on my tribal nation. So it's a huge sacrifice. And so part of it is like bringing that opportunity to our tribal nations along with the healing from the historical trauma.
So your civic engagement programs include voter registration, voter mobilization, public Native training. And in normal circumstances, I'm pretty sure it would be it's always hard work, right? But I'm pretty sure it's a little bit easier than it is right now during a global pandemic. I kind of want to understand, how have you been able to adapt and pivot during this time amidst COVID-19?
Yeah, so it's been interesting. So previous to COVID, we would be having, 200,000 conversations, 150,000 conversations in a summer. And that is because we have powwows, which are social dances on each of our tribal nations that start mid-March and pretty much carry on all the way through September. And so we hire people to, or our staff goes and we table at the powwows and talk to people about, what is civic engagement? What is voting? Why should you care? How does it impact our lives, from education to tribal colleges? Every one of our tribal nations have a tribal college on them. And so we just have to find ways to connect with them. And so our struggle, which I don't think we're going to meet it. We're just not going to meet it. I would be surprised if we did, is having those conversations remotely. So over Zoom or Facebook or text or call. And so we're trying to hire up, over 100 people, 150, 200 people was our goal. But it's hard to get that because, people aren't wanting to leave their homes because COVID hit our tribal nations really bad, especially the Northern Cheyenne, the Crow, the Fort Peck, and then the Blackfeet tribal nations. Those four have been hit pretty hard. So not a lot of people are willing to go anywhere. And so ballot pickup is a challenge for us right now. How are we doing contactless ballot pickup? So we're figuring out, we hired 2 public health advisors to give us very strict and robust COVID practices and policies. Anybody we hire has to go through this COVID training. We require no contact, or if there's very clear guidelines of how to sanitize and how to clean. For the census, we did drive-through census get counted centers, and that had a pretty good turnout. And we're doing drive-through or walk-through, depending on where it is, membership recruitment now. To get people, on our membership list and to keep them engaged beyond the election, as like no finish line there. And I agree. I mean, I couldn't agree more with that. Another little tangent. When I started this work in 2012, I thought, oh yay, after the election, we can rest and take a breath. And here we go, fast forward 8 years later, I still haven't taken that rest and taken time to catch a breather, because it's always, planning for the next one. And right after the election, we go into our legislative session, then you plan for the next election. So it's just like, you just keep going. So we got to figure out how to program in that downtime. And then we go into the powwow season every summer. So we've hired, I think we have about 100 people hired. And in our tribal nations, there are different, the tribal nation, here's the boundaries of it. There's different communities all over. And so we've tried to hire one person from each of those remote communities. So because you kind of know everybody within your little community, or at least know of other people. And so that's how we're getting contact with people. We're like, okay, talk to everybody in your community and you talk to everybody in your community. And so that's one of the ways that we're trying, and we'll see if it works. We still have, however, I will say we did have a little increase in turnout in the primary this year. And that was without any efforts to go out and collect ballots or anything like that. So, and I think that's the success of our organization and when these COVID times, and how we've been able to sustain, is because we've had good relationships and good trust with the tribal governments. And so they're working with us. Most of our employees are deemed essential, so they can be out, and about in our communities, because a lot of the tribal governments have stay-at-home orders, which means you can't leave your house, obviously. But if you do, you get fined, and so that's how bad COVID is on our tribal nations. They have stay-at-home orders in place. But thankfully, because of our powerful and really thorough COVID training and protocols, most of our employees are deemed essential, and they're able to continue to go out and do ballot pickup work.
So we've talked about so much today, and you have taught us so much. And to that end, I kind of want to touch on what gives you hope about the future of Montana and its tribal nations.
Yeah, so I've had to, really reach down on days of frustration and find that hope. But I think every day it's the gratitude that I have for my ancestors that fought for this. Like I heard an elder say, this isn't the first pandemic or, infection of a disease that we have been through as Native Americans. We had the smallpox, kill off a lot of our people. And so it's the resilience of our ancestors that I rely on and gives me hope. if they had the courage and the strength and the wisdom to overcome it back then, we have it still, right? That we carry that strength within us from our ancestors, all of us. And so that's one thing. And also like, and so that's on like for Native communities. As for Montana, what I gain hope from is efforts to build bridges between races in our community. So between the mostly the whites and the natives, because that's kind of, you know, the majority of the folks here. That's what gives me hope for a better Montana is I have in this time of under this administration, and then especially through the COVID, I have had the opportunity to meet some, you know, white folks who weren't so aware of things, didn't know things about our communities. A lot of the stuff I just shared with you all, people that live right here in Montana don't know that stuff. And so I've had the opportunity to spend time talking to white folks about our communities and our strengths and our challenges and our opportunities. And I think if we can just keep having those conversations and white folks, you know, lean into these conversations, we can build a better tomorrow here in Montana. But if we all learn how to stand together, those of us that are loving and accepting of everybody, you know, I think we'll see a better tomorrow. And so those are the two big things that give me hope is the resilience of our ancestors and the commitment of a lot of folks to try and learn how to have those hard conversations. I heard from they said, lean into this conversation without blame, shame, or guilt. And so I have started using that in talking to white folks here, you know, because like I, as a Native, could blame the white person, but it wasn't them, it was their ancestors, right? And there shouldn't be any guilt on my part, and there shouldn't be any guilt on their part if we're doing our part to try and make up for those and understand and not treat me differently because I'm Native, because of maybe an experience or a story that you've held, or maybe your parents said negative things about Native Americans. And so I try to do that, lean in without the blame, shame, or guilt, because I am one that, you know, have said things about racism and the way I've been treated. And, you know, I think it's just a way to work together to find a solution to move towards a better tomorrow.
Absolutely. Well, Marci, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate you more than you know. All the work that you're doing in Montana is absolutely incredible. We hope this is just the start of a long-term partnership and relationship that we can continue to have.
Okay, thank you. Have a great day, everybody.